Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce, Ukraine War News Update, second part thereof for the 19th of March 2025. I'm a little bit delayed because I've been down a YouTube rabbit hole. I was today years old when I discovered Messi by Lola Young, and I was blown away, and I don't know what I'm more blown away by, Messi by Lola Young, and actually the live version on Jimmy Fallon, amazing, or the Triple J cover, or the cover on Triple J by Lola Young and a band of The Cure's Close to Me, which was just double chef's kiss. Brilliant. Anyway, Lola Young, it's a new discovery for me today. I've been so ensconced in war in Ukraine and geopolitics that I've got such huge music collection just there, just at my fingertips. It's a huge, music was my life when I was younger. And so it's just nice to re-engage with reality once in a while. Not with reality, with culture once in a while. So sorry I'm a little bit late. I'll be getting back to that though. Loving that. I love a good YouTube rabbit hole. Postmodern Jukebox was I think my longest rabbit hole I've ever been down. It just went on for days and days. Right, let's look at the military aid to Ukraine. The UK and the EU are in advanced talks, apparently, on seizing frozen Russian assets. I've kind of hinted at this before. I don't know how probable that is going to be, or that is now. I can understand why you would want to just keep using that to underwrite continued loans to Ukraine, but also that's an absolute ton of money that could be just given straight to Ukraine. Obviously, there's going to be legal ramifications, and there might be practical difficulties of turning that into liquid cash, right? I don't know. I know a lot of it's kind of clogged up in Euroclear, so that probably is a lot to do with being cash. But I don't know. I don't know whether these frozen Russian assets are actual, concrete, almost literally concrete things. But nonetheless, there are talks, and I don't think that's good news. Okay, broad support for the EU for providing Ukraine with a military aid package worth of around 40 billion euros. The parties are currently negotiating details, said Kaja Kallas. This is now 2 days ago, because I didn't do a military aid video yesterday. So there have been these discussions. EU moves and shakers have met. And unsurprisingly, we know that Peter Shihato, Hungary, are not a big fan of the allocation. This says 20 billion euros worth of military aid to Ukraine. And we also hear that Italy and Spain are hesitant on this front. The Italian Foreign Minister Antonio Tajani said the proposal needed further discussion and that Italy was awaiting the outcome of the upcoming call between Trump and Putin. Well, I'd go full speed ahead, quite frankly. Kiev Post talks about this too early. Too early? Really? Too early to agree on EU proposed $40 billion military aid, say Italy and Spain. What do we have here? Any other extra information? Kallas's proposal received strong support from northern and eastern European countries which provide significant aid to Ukraine, Reuters wrote, but leaders are unlikely to make a final decision on the military aid package for Ukraine at the EU summit this Thursday and Friday, so it's March 20th to the 21st, according to three sources. Estonia, Denmark and Lithuania have allocated over 2% of their GDP to support Ukraine from 2022 to 2024. Meanwhile, southern European countries such as Italy, Spain, Portugal, Greece and Cyprus contributed less than 0.5% of their GDP. So there is that big difference there. I do worry a little bit about Italy because they have an interesting governmental setup. The coalition government is much more likely to favour Russia than Ukraine as a whole. But luckily, Meloni is a strong supporter of Ukraine, but she's tempered, I think, some of her rhetoric recently, trying to, I guess, get on side with, well, maybe some people say get on side with the US more. Bit of an issue there. So hopefully that will, that will sort itself out. It's not too early to double the EU's military aid to Ukraine to 40 billion. Okay, now, David Lammy, Foreign Secretary from the UK, said if the Kremlin refuses to sign a ceasefire, the G7 countries will continue to put pressure on Russia. Now, he said that the UK is increasing the number of drones, ammunition and training, sending more than 400 different assets to Ukraine. So it's good news from the UK there. What do we hear? European nations are urging the UN action against Russian satellite sabotage. That's what we heard previously. The disruptions have targeted Eutelsat and SES, Europe's main satellite providers. So actually, we're going to now talk a little bit about Eutelsat. So that was my kind of segue in. So Eutelsat have said we are able to be the substitute for Starlink, that we can provide 40,000 terminals to Ukraine. They're now saying that they have resources that are sufficient to meet Ukraine's military needs. I mean, that's a really big claim there, given the reliance on Starlink and what Starlink does for Ukraine. And the company is the only alternative to Starlink for Ukraine, and that's the CEO of the company there. Indeed, there's an article in Militiani. Let's have a little read of it about this. So Iva Berneka, CEO of European satellite communications operator Eutelsat, said the company is the only alternative to Starlink. That although Eutelsat's satellite constellation has less capacity than Starlink, it provides, quote, perfect coverage over Ukraine. I don't think that's a big problem. For important military needs, the capacity we have today in Ukraine is more than enough, she said. She also explained that Eutelsat needs fewer satellites to provide the same capacity because their orbit is located a greater distance from the Earth. So, just the way that physics works, the further out you are, the more coverage you can get, so you need fewer satellites. I don't know if they get interfered with at all with the lower orbiting Starlink satellites that are much more numerous. According to her, the company provides services to businesses, governments and customers in the field of maritime and air transport, so it does not currently have sufficient capacity to fully meet the needs of the civilian population. At the same time, Eutelsat is eager to participate in negotiations on European communication sovereignty. These are highly relevant talks today with Ukraine, but should be taking place everywhere. The European Union is in talks with 4 satellite internet operators to replace Starlink in the Ukrainian Defence Forces. Among the potential suppliers are Luxembourg's SES, Spain's Hisdesat, Britain's Viasat, and the French-British Eutelsat OneWeb. According to European Commission spokesperson Thomas Renier, Ukraine is interested in switching to alternative communication systems, including GovSatcom, a pooled network of the EU's existing national government satellite capacity. So this is where Europe is going to be stepping up from their own economic, industrial point of view and their own national security point of view. It's that kind of moving away from it dependence upon the US, and it's going to be interesting to see where this goes, and of course what Mr. Musk's reactions are to this, and if he's going to whinge about government subsidies, barriers to entry to the market, or anti-free market help, if you like, from the EU for his competitors, then the EU just turns around and says, American tariffs? Do you know what I mean? So you've got a trade war going on between the US and Europe, and in fact most of the rest of the world. And so Musk won't be in a very good position to be talking about unfair, asymmetric market situations. Right. The Russians have published a photo of an unknown Ukrainian drone Interceptor, I believe. Looks interesting. Is that what they say? Yeah, drone Interceptor. So this is a drone that is designed and manufactured, one presumes, to intercept Russian drones, such as, I presume, Orlans, Lancets, things that go deeper behind Ukrainian territory. So there's that for you. We see this video coming out from Rheinmetall of an underwater drone being provided to Ukraine, coming to the Black Sea Fleet near you. I do wonder, just there are general questions I have about these companies and entities that are designing, building weaponry for Ukraine. There must be this desire for them, counterintuitively, not to have a negotiated settlement right now. Just give it 6 months, 3 months. Let's get some of this kit that we've just poured a load of resources into, see if it's effective against the Russians. Stuff like this would be a point in hand. And the Ukrainians, I don't know. There are different arguments to suggest that a ceasefire would be beneficial for Russia, beneficial for Ukraine, beneficial for both, beneficial for neither. You've got all of those options have some fairly justified rationale behind them. And yeah, I guess there are areas where Ukraine will want to keep the pressure on the Russians. You know, the Ukrainians are hitting Russian oil and gas infrastructure really successfully at the moment. But on the flip side, Russia are hitting Ukrainian energy infrastructure. Russia is hitting Odessa as a port and giving the Ukrainians something to think about in terms of maritime and issues and export capabilities and capacities. But at the same time, Russia have had a third of their Black Sea fleet sunk and whatnot, and they've run away to, or swum away to, Novorossiysk from Sevastopol. And so, you know, there are these different dynamics going on in these different domains, air, sea, and land. And I guess that's going to have an effect on opinions and strategies of defense contractors and whatnot. Now, we have heard, as I reported yesterday, Zelensky mentioned a 3,000 kilometer range drone that successfully passed testing, and also the long Neptune that has a range of 1,000 kilometers, which can give the Muscovites something to think about. You know, can hit Moscow, arguably. OSINT analysis and a number of media outlets citing sources claim that the long Neptune strike was aimed at the Russian oil refinery in Tuapse, which is 550 kilometers from the front line. Experts interviewed by DW suggest that the missile is a new modification of the anti-ship Neptune R-360. Prior to the long Neptune, the longest range missiles used by Ukraine against Russia were only Western missiles, the ATACMS and Storm Shadow and Scalp. According to open sources, Kyiv received these missiles with a range of up to 300 kilometers. However, according to media reports, Ukraine exhausted its stockpile of American ATACMS ballistic missiles in January 2025. At the same time, the number of Storm Shadow and Scalp missiles is limited, as they were delivered by the dozens. The main issue, according to Mykola Sunorovsky, director of military programs at the Razumkov Center, is mass production, because weapons make sense when they are used en masse. How to scale production, it will be difficult. I hope that by combining the technological, production and financial resources of Ukraine and Western partners, we will be able to scale this development. That's been the issue, and that's been my frustration for sort of 2 years. Since I said at the beginning of the war, the way Ukraine win this war is with distant strikes. You do not lose troops when you are throwing missiles into Russia. Right? It is not attritional for Ukraine. So the best way to hamstring Russia, the best way to reduce their capacities, capabilities, to degrade them, is to throw all sorts of drones and missiles at them, both on the front line, the contact line, and you can do that with smaller drones, but I don't see why you can't also use things like Shahed drone equivalents to hammer the front line. And then back in the kind of Lancet range, that medium range, and then in the long range and going into Russia and all over the occupied territories in Crimea, in the Black Sea. Ukraine just need to be scaling up, and they know this. They've been trying to do that, but it just is difficult. There are practical issues, evidently, as to why they can't produce Neptunes and ballistic missiles and cruise missiles, particularly at the rate that everyone would like them. And I wonder as well whether there are issues in building launchers. I know nothing. I've heard nothing about how they launch these. We hear quite often about missiles, but never much about how they launch them. So with HIMARS missiles or equivalent, you're thinking, yeah, they're brilliant. You need more and more of these. But obviously, you also talk about the HIMARS launchers or the Mars 2 or whatever it is. And you talk about these things in tandem. But when we talk about Neptune missiles, we only ever sort of talk about the missile. Well, what is the launcher? How easy is it for Ukrainians to launch these missiles and to get those launchers around? Are they mobile launchers? So on and so forth. So I lots of questions I have that we call it they're answered. Answers on a postcard. Right, 20,000 Sphere fragmentation FPV drones have been supplied to drone units after a sponsorship by the Ukrainian drone manufacturer Deviro with Steel Hornets, the maker of the printed munition casings. These munitions can be fused for airburst or impact. So here's a video. It's interesting stuff, and this is, I guess, the power of 3D printing, because I think these are, the Sphere 1.1 is a scalable Ukrainian drone munition made from printed components. Each fragmentation ring with plastic explosive is 200 grams for a total of 1.1 kilograms. You get a four-part munition. So here is someone screwing this together and creating, well, I guess you can have a tiny munition or a larger munition and anywhere in between. So taking that apart, and then you can screw in these fragmentation 3D printed rings to make, a medium size one, or make it even larger, and then drop these from your IED dropping drone. And there you go. That's modern warfare. You can make your weapons pretty much on the front line. You just need a 3D printer and obviously you need the components for it. In 2024, the Ukrainian military industrial complex produced weapons worth $10 billion. In 2022, it was $1 billion. So 2022, $1 billion, multiplied by 3, 2023 gave them $3 billion. And then from 3 billion to 10 billion is more than a factor of 3. Excellent from the Ukrainians to be able to increase that production so significantly. In 2025, production is expected to increase to 30 to 35 billion, keeping that same kind of factor going there. That's so impressive. So impressive. Okay, about 6 countries, including UK, France, Turkey, Canada, and Australia. I love that. About 6 countries, and I'm going to name 5 of them. What about that poor 6th country? 6 countries, including these 5, are discussing plans to send up to 30,000 troops to Ukraine, according to the Times, and I reported that yesterday. Other countries are ready to help with weapons and logistics. But I just wanted to have that as a segue into this. And Macron was criticised, well, not criticised, but, he's got this point that Russia are like, we don't want to see NATO troops. We don't want to see European troops in Ukraine, and making these demands to Ukraine. And then Macron nailed it by saying, when Putin brought North Korean soldiers onto his soil, did he ask the Ukrainian president for permission to do so? No, he did not. Then why ask and coordinate with Putin the introduction of European peacekeepers into Ukraine? Boom, drop mic. Thank you very much. Take that, Putin. Stick that in your pipe and smoke it. Is all I have to say there. Ukraine has approved reforms allowing military personnel aged from 18 to 24 to pursue higher education without leaving service. Defense Minister Umerov said the move, part of the contract 18 to 24 project, will help soldiers gain skills for both military and civilian careers. So what they want to do is attract soldiers to fight for them voluntarily without needing to forcefully mobilize the cohort from 18 to 24. And as I've explained before, and I did so on the Naked Diner podcast, go and check that out on YouTube. We talked about how, the demographic doesn't help. So they've got this black hole in that age group. They've got a black hole in the infancy, in the birth rates, and in those cohorts. So the people most likely to have those babies are your 18 to 24-year-olds, arguably. And so there's a kind of double-edged sword there. You start mobilizing there. Even though you really, really need to, there aren't enough of them. It will hurt your birth rates even more, and it will hurt your economy. People will run away. You'll get a loss of workforce that will have a real pressure on the labour market, and it will really hurt you economically. And then also you're losing these people in terms of vocational or academic training. So the skill set of your workforce then diminishes. So one way around that is to attract people voluntarily from those cohorts and say, and by the way, you can still go to university, have your vocational training and military training alongside of that. And if you're in the military, then you can still partake in higher education without having to leave the service. And that means that people are more likely to come in voluntarily. And you're still, hopefully, if those people survive, I mean, that's what you want, right? These people then be able to demobilize and be skilled up and add something to the workforce and the economy. So that's all perfectly sensible. Now, there are a record high level of Americans saying the US isn't doing enough for Ukraine, according to a new poll, reports the New York Post. This is interesting because it kind of bucks the idea that the Republicans are, exactly like Trump and his administration and kind of anti-Ukraine and pro-Russia, and that's not the case. And actually, if you look at the polls, it does very much look like most people know that Putin's a bad guy. Like even with a lot of MAGA Republicans, not all of them. But however, my caveat to this is I suspect it is becoming more of a partisan issue. And the more people saying that the US is not doing enough for Ukraine are probably the ones who are undecided on the Democratic side, who are now seeing this as a partisan issue and seeing what's happening in the negotiations are getting more and more frustrated with the Trump administration and coming off the fence to then side with people that strongly think the US needs to be doing more. That's my speculation. I don't know if that's true at all. So please take that with a pinch of salt. But I imagine it's not so much that you've got Republicans coming to a realization that the US needs to do more. Because all the signs from their own party is that's not the case unless you listen to, say, Mitch McConnell or, Ron Bacon or some of these other people. But generally speaking, the administration is telling the people that they need to get that money back and blah, 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 and all the stuff we hear from Trump and Vance all the time. So I'm fairly sure that's going to be underwritten by people moving from neither nor to, US needs to be doing more. And also independence, not just Democrats, independence as well, of course. Really interesting looking at, so trying to work out how popular Trump is. Trump has got 47%. He's underwater in terms of favorability, but he's more popular than he has ever been. Like, he's the most unpopular president in the history of presidents at this time in his presidency, apart from Trump 1.0. So he's marginally more popular than he was in Trump. I think it's 46% then and 47% now, something like that. But I saw some polling that came out, yesterday that was of people who didn't vote in the 2024 elections. And of the people who didn't vote, because when you take them into account, like 2/3 of the people didn't want Trump as president. So he arguably, but of course, which way would those people who didn't vote have gone if they were forced to vote? But anyway, as with many elections, there are significant numbers of people who don't vote. And one of the objectives is trying to mobilize those people. But anyway, when it comes to Trump, it was something like of people who didn't vote, he has a net unfavorability of something huge. It's like 83% disapprove of him and 17% approve. So of that group, so if you were like a Democratic strategist, you'd be like, that's who we want to get out to vote, because it turns out the people who didn't vote absolutely hate Trump. So that's a fascinating dynamic. So when you're talking about aid to Ukraine, what you want to do is you're going to mobilize the sentiments of people who want more aid to go to Ukraine. The problem is that particular group is the most likely to be politically unaffiliated and therefore kind of politically inactive. But anyway, the Pentagon is so now we're moving on to kind of military aid adjacent stuff. So the Pentagon's undertaking a significant restructuring of the US military's combatant commands and headquarters, and one of the plans under consideration would involve the US giving up the role of NATO's supreme allied commander of Europe. So traditionally you've got a 4-star general who is in charge of NATO in Europe, right? And that's always an American. So Trump admin considers giving up NATO command that has been exclusively American since Eisenhower. That is a big move. Now, some people might say, yeah, fair enough. I mean, it's a European theatre, but it is a case of the US giving up influence and power in Europe. So while you might say, yeah, Europe needs to stand on your own 2 feet, this conversation we always have, right? If you are an American, you would, even no matter what American you were, politically speaking, surely you can't argue that it would be beneficial for America to be in a command position in Europe. I mean, it's not necessarily a big thing about spending money. It's like you would want the US to be making the decisions in Europe if you were American. I know I would. I'd be like, yeah, like therefore the decisions of NATO in Europe would be in the US's best interest. So I think that's a really interesting move there, and it is the US receding from power around the world. I can't see it in any other way. We've had the big news from yesterday that I mentioned in the live stream last night, Germany's Bundestag approved a major constitutional amendment to loosen the country's strict debt brake policy, paving the way for increased spending on defence, infrastructure and climate neutrality. I think this is now going to allow 500 billion euros of expenditure on defence and infrastructure. The amendment proposed by the Social Democratic Party, the SPD, and the CDU-CSU alliance, so that's Friedrich Merz's party, to loosen debt restrictions in Germany's basic law was supported by 513 Bundestag members, with 207 voting against it. So a pretty good majority there. The bill was passed with the necessary majority of votes, Bundestag President Barbel Bass said. Now the document still has to be approved by the Bundesrat. If the bill enters into force, Articles 109 and 115 of the Basic Law will stipulate that defence, civil defence, intelligence and cybersecurity spending will be exempt from the debt rule if it exceeds 1% of GDP. So good news for Ukraine down the line. Now, fact of the day, yesterday Estonia became the first NATO member since 1989 to allocate 5% of its GDP in defence in its budget. So when you have Americans complain that Europe isn't spending enough, Europe is a very, it's a great range of countries. There's a spectrum of expenditure on defence. So you can compare Portugal to Estonia and you get, there are two very different figures going on there. So when Americans, for example, and I talk about, the Trump administration, saying that the US is paying for Europe, or the US is paying their fair share and Europe aren't, don't use the term Europe, because it's an umbrella term covering many countries, and those countries do very different things. President of France Emmanuel Macron has called on French manufacturers to increase the volume of arms production. Paris is offering arms contracts to European countries. As of 2023, France was among the top 10 countries in the world in terms of military spending, as well as among the top 5 countries in the world in terms of military exports. In fact, it's number 2. Ahead of it are the US, Germany and China. Not sure that is, actually. France's military-industrial complex accounts for more than 25% of all European military capacity. Since the start of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, France has made tremendous progress, says Anton Gerashenko, in its military-industrial complex. In an interview with Le Figaro in early 2025, the French president said he would like to allocate about 3 to 3.5% of GDP on defence instead of the current 2.1%. Army budgets are approved in the military planning law. The current law covers the period from 2030, that is, and envisages spending 413 billion euros. For 2025, 50.5 billion is allocated for defence spending. If France were to spend 3.5% of GDP based on current levels, it would allocate 70 billion per year for defence, not 50 billion. So that's another 20 billion each year. France is one of the few European countries with a defence industry capable of developing weapons from start to finish without being dependent on the United States. Currently, the French military-industrial complex includes 9 major industrial groups: Airbus Defence and Space, Ariane Group, Arcus, Dassault Aviation, MBDA, Naval Group, KNDS France, Safran and Thales. Interesting stuff there. Gives us a good bit of context. Now, the capacity of Forge du Table could be increased to a maximum of 20,000 shells per day. The Forge du Table, so this is obviously an ammunition factory, has an ambition to produce more than 7 million artillery shell bodies a year. Obviously, that's a shell body, not the shell as a whole, so dependent on, I presume, explosives manufacturing and so on and so forth. That's just the kind of forging the shell. But that's incredible. I don't know where that comes from, French aid to Ukraine, where that claim comes from. But the French have traditionally built very few numbers of ammunition shells and concentrated on quality over quantity, but actually quantity is needed. Macron, again, has announced massive investment, including 2 new squadrons of Rafales carrying hypersonic missiles, in an additional French airborne nuclear deterrent base right on the German border. So this is, I think, by 2035, they're looking at getting airborne nuclear bombers on the German border. Important signalling before the Trump-Putin call, and as Germany's parliament votes to remove constitutional limits on the defence spending. So France is really, really stepping up. Shashant Joshi asked whether it's 2 additional squadrons or 2 new squadrons to replace old ones. Macron is reportedly resisting, however, British defence companies being included in the 800 billion rearmament plan for Europe. Now, This doesn't surprise me. France always wants stuff built within France, or by extension, the EU. EU money spent in the EU, and I understand that. UK's come out of the EU. I just watched quite an interesting little synopsis. Let's find it. Yeah, here it is. It's TLDI News, which is predominantly for like slightly younger audiences, but I find them quite useful for just real synopses of some geopolitical stuff. And they've got a video on our Labour, as in the UK government, quietly cozying up to the EU. And it's interesting that, yes, they are, but they're having to do it in ways that were quite predictable in defence particularly. And so what you might see is the UK join some kind of pan-European defence strategy. So that's kind of a formalised partnership between the UK and the EU, maybe like Norway and others as well. And as a result, that may allay kind of fears of from France of money going out of the EU and into the UK. The UK kind of really wants to join, I think, recognises it wants to join the EU, but understands that there are still Leave voters that are very active. The Labour Party was kind of split 50-50 in terms of Leave and Remain. Lib Dems were very Remain, and Conservatives weren't completely. They were. Well, I can't remember what it was. Was it 60% Leave, 40% Remain, or something like that? So you had. It was complex for Labour, and it still remains so. But actually, more across every single party, some of the data is really interesting. Is that everybody, even in Reform, all parties, the majority of people think Brexit was bad. So some people are saying it was bad just in general. Other people saying it was badly done. So your Reform voters are going to be like, well, we just cocked up how we came out of Europe, etc., etc. But everyone agrees it was crap, right? So Brexit is crap for the UK. There are very few people that are arguing that Brexit's been a complete success, even from the Reform voters, right? Because the data is coming in, and economically we're being screwed, and actually immigration has been a massive problem just from outside of Europe, right? So at least as far as the many of these people are concerned. So how does Labour get back in when they said there are red lines about not joining the customs union? You know, and their electoral campaign was on not rejoining the EU, but actually they kind of need to for economic reasons. So that's something to look for, which is defence. That's how the UK, I think, is going to cozy up to the EU's in terms of defence, and that's what that video showed. So Macron is resisting UK receiving that I guess EU money, or UK arms manufacturers. So this might be where you start seeing UK arms manufacturers really, which is already the case, setting up in Europe in order to receive European money. Canada's defence ministry says the contract remains in place, and Ottawa has made a legal commitment of funds for the first 16 F-35 aircraft. So we're talking about cancelling the F-35 deal, about this whole argument between the US and everyone else. Quote, we are not cancelling the F-35 contract, but we do need to do our homework given the changing environment. I think that's what Bill Blair said. Mark Carney says that Canada might cut rather than cancel the F-35 order. Guess this would imply buying two types of jets. Quote, Ottawa wants to determine whether buying European and British military goods, it can procure more industrial benefits for Canada. So this is going to be about, well, how much of these planes can we build in Canada? And this is where, like, Europe and UK, you know, EU and UK are going to have to go to Canada and sweeten them, and it becomes an industrial partnership, or F-35 say to, you know, Lockheed Martin go and speak to Canada. But then if you've got a trade war going on with the US, then that becomes a barrier for the F-35 deal to go through. Canada has made a $6 billion Canadian dollar, 4.2 billion US dollar deal with Australia to develop a cutting-edge radar for the Arctic. Now, this is probably a long-term time in the making, but it's just another interesting situation where, you know, it's done with an Australian company, not with an American, that can detect hypersonic missiles and other threats over the curvature of the Earth, according to Prime Minister Mark Carney, announced on Tuesday. Of course, anything like that is evidence that we do not live on a flat Earth. Now, I do have one viewer that still is a flat earther. I know, because he's made the claims before. It's like, it makes no sense of science. You wouldn't be like, you don't have people developing the ability to detect hypersonic missiles over the curvature of the Earth if we don't live on a globe. You absolute muppets. And we've heard from Mette Frederiksen, the Danish Prime Minister, that Europe has to rearm in 3 to 5 years and become self-sufficient in that time, or risk an attack from Russia. Urgent rearmament to deter Russian aggression is called for. Hybrid warfare Sabotage and disinformation. She's warning about that. It says Moscow could strike an EU country soon if Europe stays weak. No illusions about Putin. Fredrickson doubts Russia's willingness for peace. Quote, their actions are against humanity, against Europe, against everything we stand for. Denmark backs EU arms production, but also wants flexibility to buy weapons from the UK and Norway. Interesting. So she's actually up for spending that money in the UK and Norway, whereas Emmanuel Macron less so. Anyway, that's enough from me. Take care, guys. Speak to you soon.